Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, The Power of Telling Your Story When Speaking. And it's about the business story, the power of using your business story and using that to create impact. Those of you who are new to webinars, and I notice a few people just logging on as we start. Those of you who are new to webinars, please ask questions as we go. Don't wait for me to stop and say, are there any questions? Ask questions by typing in the dialog box, or at any stage you can put your hand up and I can open up your microphone, assuming you've got a microphone and you're in a quiet office where you can speak, and then you can speak your question. One of the most important things I think for webinars and for any learning is about thinking and applying some of the content I give you to your real life circumstances. So one way to do that is think of a recent presentation you've done, and could have you incorporated any of these new skills I'm teaching you into that previous presentation? Or on the other side, think of a presentation you've got coming up. Maybe you're going to present at Toastmasters, maybe you've got a seminar, maybe you've got a conference. Can you incorporate a business story to make your presentation more effective? It's about the application of the learning that's more important than just taking reams of notes and thinking that that's interesting and then not using it. As I said, ask questions as we go, type in the dialog box, even make comments. Agree with me, disagree with me. Type in your own example, and then I can speak it out so everyone can hear what your comment or what your question is. So let's get started. All of us have got stories. We've got stories through our life, through our businesses, through our careers that we can share with other people. The power of stories is in advocating for a change or on behalf of other people that don't have the same strength, the same knowledge. You can educate people. You can use a story to create that information that people need. Stories are a great way of influencing and persuading people to a new way of thinking. You can promote new ideas, new thinking. You can create change by using your stories. All the great speakers around the world use stories. They are storytellers. So this webinar, my aim would be that you walk away with one or two things, one or two bits of knowledge that you can use the next time you're presenting, and with the idea that maybe you should be using stories in your business presentations, in your everyday presentations. Why tell stories? Why not just give the data? You know you're right. You've got the statistics, the black and white. There's the trend data. This is a no-brainer. I don't need to tell a story to create this change or to persuade people of what my new position is. Why do I tell stories? Well, here's some information that may help you. If you tell some people some facts, so those of you who are just listening to me, and let's say you turn down your screen and you're not looking at me, you just hear me. Apparently in a week's time, 1 out of 10 of you will remember the information I've told you. Your retention rate's about 10%. If you just tell people facts, data, case studies, informations, about a 10% retention rate. Now, have a look at the videos. In fact, let me give you a handout. Rather, look at the PowerPoint slides. I can send you some videos on storytelling later on. Look at those, and you've increased the retention rate by 3 times, up to about 30%. Do a handout, do some flip charts. Those of you who've been to my workshops know I like to use the whiteboard, and I put flip charts around the wall, and then you can go around and take photos of them, as well as talking to you and as well as using PowerPoint. So I've trebled your retention rate to 30%. So that means 7 out of 10 of your audience are still going to walk out, and a week later won't have any retention or recollection of what that was really about. If you tell people a story with examples and it is engaging and creates that emotional journey, it creates that emotional roller coaster ride, then you're increasing your attention to around 70%. That's why you tell stories. If you just give the facts, the data, the information, put the graph up on the wall on the PowerPoint slide and say, I've done my job, that's all I'm required to do, and you impact a third of the audience, you may be satisfied with that. But generally, we get before a group of people for the reason of making change. If you want to make change, if you want to influence, you need a story. There's a saying that professional speakers use. You won't remember much of what I've told you, but you'll remember how I've made you feel. So as a trainer, facilitator, educator, your role is to create an emotional response in your audience. What that means is people will remember that you've given them light at the end of the tunnel. You can now see a way forward. You now realize that I too can be successful. I may not remember your 4-step process, your 3 layers of complexity, your data or your model, but I'll remember, wow, I can do this. So you need to create that emotional response. What they say is if you give data, information, statistics, graphs, charts, you're appealing to the neurological senses. You're appealing to our logic, to our thinking, to our brain that does the analysis. If you tell a story and create the emotion, then you're appealing to our gut, to our visceral response. You need to get people in the gut. I did a keynote yesterday on this very topic. There was 160 people in the room. It was Connect groups and Link West. So they're the self-help groups and the community centres and the resource centres from regional Western Australia, all the not-for-profits, the Cancer Council, the Cystic Fibrosis Council, all of those kinds of organisations in a conference. And I told my story. And I told them how to tell stories. People came up to me and said they were crying during the presentation. So what I'm saying is that they won't remember much of what I've told them, but they'll remember that I've given them hope, showing light at the end of the tunnel. That's why you tell stories. Really important. Most people, when they go shopping, Christmas shopping, dare I mention it, it's still a long way off, but coming very close. Most people, when they go Christmas shopping, walk around the shop. They know they've got to get presents for their children, their parents, or whatever, and they go on gut instincts and they buy in the shop on what feels right. A few people, but not the majority, a few people will do a spreadsheet, will use a decision-making tree, will use a logic strategy to choose how they buy their presents. That's not the majority. The majority of people buy on gut instinct. That's why you tell your story. The other powerful thing with stories are they're your unique intellectual property. So someone can't say that's not true, that won't work, I don't agree with you. If you tell your story where you've resolved conflict, you've helped a family with a complex difficulties, maybe they've got a child with an intellectual disability or some other problem within the aged care, and you help people come through that with your unique approach, your thinking outside the box, problem solving, and those people are happy, they're successful, they've moved on through their crisis. That's your story, and that is your unique intellectual property. And maybe it's outside the normal policy book, outside normal guidelines. Maybe it's not what you meant to do, but you did it and you succeeded. And that is your unique intellectual property. I was speaking to someone from the fire brigade yesterday at the not-for-profit. So volunteer fire brigades are not-for-profit, and they're talking about one of the fires this year. And they said the fire chief disobeyed the commandment of head office in Perth. This is our bushfires this summer. Disobeyed and used his local knowledge to take all the firefighters somewhere else, stop the fire from crossing the river, and saved the town. So that's not policy, that's not procedure, that's not the guidelines, but this person used initiative. And if this person's telling their story and everyone says, no, you can't do that, he can say, well, if I didn't do that, then the community would have burnt down. It's your unique intellectual property. No one can tell you that that did not happen, that will not work, that is not correct. If you've done it, you've walked the talk, and you've been successful. So how do you tell the story? Let's unravel the story. The first thing is you tell the story. In fact, let's take a step back. You use a story to illustrate a point. So perhaps the first place to start is, what point do you want to make? And that's really around the point you want to leave your audience with. Then you can choose the story that best illustrates the point. If you tell a story that doesn't have a point, then you're a comedian or some other form of entertainer, a stand-up comedian. Generally, you're not. Generally, you tell a story to make a point. So the next thing is really important as well. If you make a point, just one moment while I remove those scribbles. Okay, my mouse has just seized up on me. If you make a point that doesn't have a benefit to the audience, then once again, you must be a stand-up comedian. Or you're making a point that's important to you that is no value to the audience. So this is the process you use. You tell a story, you illustrate the point that you're making about the story, and then you highlight the benefit to the audience. So before I share a quick story with you, one of the things I teach in my public speaking workshops is know your audience inside out. You need to know who is in the room, what their values are, what their cultural nuances are, what they want, what their pain is, how you're going to solve their pain. Really important. So I encourage people to invest lots and lots of time knowing who's in the room. Okay, let me share a story with you where I disobeyed, I neglected my own number one rule, know who's in the room. Recently, I went to Nepal to do some trekking in Kathmandu. I had my whole family there. It was a beautiful opportunity, fantastic trekking in the foothills of the Himalayas. Some friends knew I was over there and they asked me if I would speak at a conference in Kathmandu. Only a small conference, about 50 people in the room. And I started my presentation by saying, who in the room has heard of Steve Jobs? And everyone in the room bobbed their head from side to side as if to say no. And I looked at them and I said, surely you must have heard of Steve Jobs. And I grabbed my iPhone out of my pocket and I said, you know, Steve Jobs, the iPhone, most of you've got iPhones, I noticed. You must have heard of Steve Jobs. Once again, they bobbed their head from side to side as if to say no. In desperation, I said, come on, guys, Apple computers, iPhone, Steve Jobs, I know he's died. The young man down the front looked at me and bobbed his head from side to side and said, Peter, we all know who Steve Jobs is. And of course, within the Hindu culture, the bobbing of the head from side to side means yes, not no. So I looked like a real idiot. I was stupid and I didn't take the courtesy to know who was in my room. So what I tell all of you, make sure you know who's in the room. Are there any cultural nuances? What do the people need? So there's a short story. The story is my trip to Kathmandu and trekking in Nepal, but my conference within Kathmandu. The point, know your audience. Yep, know your audience. And if you don't know your audience, you may stuff up and look really silly like I did in front of that audience. The benefit to you guys, the value, is that if you take the time to know your audience, you will never look silly like Peter Jew did. If you don't have a benefit, then why are you speaking to that group of people if you're giving them no value? If you're not making a point, then you must be a comedian or some other form of entertainer. But even entertaining speakers, inspirational speakers, the sporting celebrities generally have a point. They often don't make the point relevant to the audience. So once again, it's just their entertainment. So really important that you make sure your story has a point and a value to the audience. One other tip, relive your story rather than retell your story. Over the webinar, it was very hard for me to relive that story, but I relived this story yesterday in front of the audience in my keynote presentation, and I was there. I was back in Kathmandu, and I was doing the nonverbals, and I was exasperated as they all shook their head and said no. To me, they said no. They were really saying yes. Far better to relive. So that's part of the emotional transportation. Go back there. Experience the pain or the success or the joy or the passion as you tell the story, as opposed to just saying the story. You'll find that really helpful. The business story. And this is just, I guess, another layer on what I've already said. The business story is data plus story. So do you speak as if it was the present moment? Yes. So let me share a story with you 12 months ago when I was in Kathmandu. I was in the room doing a presentation and I started with this fantastic quote. Or I started by saying, who of you knows Steve Jobs? As if you're in the moment is how you relive the story. So data plus story. What is data? Examples, case studies, researches, pie chart, graphs, your numbers, your facts and figures, return on investment, break-even analysis. They appeal to the head, to our logic, to our thinking, to our analytical side of the brain. Yep, important. The story, not the data now. This is your personal stories. Your vulnerability, when you were uncertain yourself, the stories that have the point, remember, the purpose, stories that illustrate your data. So my data was know your audience inside out. Be aware of any cultural nuances. Then my story is abandoning my own rule and illustrating to you what can happen if you don't take the time to know your audience. Feel free to share your struggle, your own uncertainty, and then if there's success at the end of the struggle, then that's brilliant. Not all stories, by the way, have to be successful stories. There may be the story where you didn't get the outcome you wanted and it was a monumental mistake. It's the lesson, it's the point that highlights the story and illustrates the value to your audience. So it's okay to have a story where you weren't the champion, where you didn't win. When you merge these two together, the data and the story appeals to the head. Sorry, the data appeals to the head, the story appeals to the heart, the gut, the visceral response. These two things combined are what inspire, persuade, influence, engage, and have the impact as a speaker. I love this quote from Brené Brown, and this is from a TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability. If you haven't seen the TED Talk from Brené Brown, I suggest you do watch it at some stage, 20 minutes. Maybe stories are just data with a soul. Remember, people are not going to remember the facts, the information, the data. They're going to remember how you made them feel. That's the soul. That's the visceral response. Where do you get your stories from? Basically everywhere, everyday life. Those mistakes you make, the people you meet, the problems you solve, the unexpected events, the problems you don't solve. More importantly, the best stories come from the heart rather than the head. So don't spend too much time trying to construct a story. It's just those everyday events. I just went to Nepal, to Kathmandu, and then trekking in the Annapurna with my family. The trek was amazing. The little story comes from my muck up in doing that presentation that I agreed to do. They come from everywhere, but choose the stories that come from the heart rather than from the head. So don't think too much about it from a logical point of view. What experience have you had in your life that illustrates a point you're trying to make? The other thing to be aware of, and this is not in the slides, the fresher, the newer the story is better than the story that's 10 years old. So in terms of demonstrating the importance of knowing your audience, in another 6 months, 12 months, my Kathmandu story may become a bit old and I'll collect another story. Don't worry, don't be concerned for me, because between now and the next 6 months, I will make plenty of mistakes. And in those mistakes, there'll be a story. There'll be another thing that I do wrong, another person I offend in a workshop, and I'll just grab that as a story because I didn't take the time to understand who was in the room, if that is the point that I'm making. Stories are everywhere. I'm going to end with this quote from Seth Godin. Seth Godin's a great social commentator. He's written lots of best books, Blue Cow Marketing, lots of other things. The marketer's job, I'm just going to stop for a moment now. You understand in your work, in your business, you are a marketer. You are a marketer of knowledge, of information, of hope, of safety, health and safety, of helping people get to a better place in their life, achieving their key performance indicators. Presentations, educations, seminars, facilitation is marketing information. The marketer's job then is to tell a true story, one that resonates and one that matters. So this is the benefit to the people. If it doesn't matter to the people, then why are you telling it? And to repeat it often enough that it creates value. So I'm going to pause for a moment. Any final questions around business storytelling or the power of telling your story? I did run a webinar about 9 months ago on 6 common mistakes when telling your stories. So I have that information in a different webinar that if you're interested, I can share that with you. Just send me an email and say, Peter, what were those 6 common mistakes? Any other questions? Upcoming workshops. I've just come back from Karratha where I was able to run a winning presentation skills, and my wife Violet ran a series of difficult conversations in Karratha. We've got a couple of workshops in Bunbury coming up, so if you've got colleagues or your organisation has a branch in Bunbury, please let people know. Going to Brisbane, I've got a big trip in Queensland, not open workshops, but in-house workshops in Brisbane, Townsville and Cairns, but Violet's running an assertive communication skills workshop in Brisbane. Feel the Fear in Perth, 8th of October, and I do take Feel the Fear around the country as well. So if you had the need for a Feel the Fear, this is Susan Jeffers' best-selling self-help book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. I'm licensed to run her workshops and use her intellectual property. Other workshops in Perth, a series in Melbourne, and relatively quiet on the open community workshops, very busy on the in-house internal workshops. A couple of webinars coming up, free. So guys, register for these if you're not already. How to effectively use the platform. So this is your stage presence. This is other than standing behind the lectern for your entire presentation, your entire workshop. How do you use the platform effectively? And some really high level platform mechanics I can show you and demonstrate within the 30 minutes webinars. How to think and speak off the cuff. So you're given no notice. Can you say something about this, please, John? Pauline, I'd really like you to just give a quick 5-minute update. Stephen, would you like to comment on that? That's a really great question I've just had. In fact, I've got an expert in the room. Kageni, would you like to answer that question for everyone in the room? You know when you're on and you weren't planning to be on, thinking and speaking off the cuff. Only going to give you some snapshots because it's only a half-hour webinar. Any last questions on using your stories to create that business message and to influence? Remember, I guess from today, you won't remember much of what I've said. It's more about how I've made you feel. And if you feel, wow, stories now have a part to play in my next presentation and my future engagement, then you're more likely to remember that. If you can just remember the 3-step process, then you may not forget that. You'll probably remember Kathmandu and the Nepalese people bobbing their head from side to side saying yes. Yeah. And you probably think, wow, Peter's looked really silly. And then you'll go back, but what was the 3-step process that he used that to illustrate? And if you forget, you can ring me, you can email me. So create that visceral emotional response and you'll have impact. There's no further questions. I'll end the webinar. 27 minutes. I'm quite happy with that. Last questions?